to the battery, and then you want to repeat this process over and over and over. But what you really want to do is you want to go as fast as you can without a capacitor, for the simple fact is you want to put a lot of this radiant energy to the source.
1, 2. Okay. All right. So that little diode there in red, if you notice, the on the right side of the battery is a plus coming out, orange and green. So orange and green here, showing you the showing you the plus charging the bottom coil, which is the drive coil. Heads back up this way to charge the coil. Comes through the coil, down through here, back up. Oops. Man. Yeah. Comes down here, down the negative rail of the relay to negative. And that's how it charges up the bottom coil. Once it gets down to the negative here, the plus can continue on this way with orange and green. And it can get through the top coil through here. And, through here and go, if that little red diode's not there, it can go up and to negative. Which would be, right, should be up here. To the right side of the contact, down to negative. And that's why that little diode is there. It blocks it from getting the negative, not allowing this coil to charge, which is good news. So if this coil gets charged, and when this bottom coil is the drive coil, the top coil is supposed to be a wireless stator coil. So when the bottom coil gets charged, if the stator coil on top gets a small amount of charge after the bottom coil receives charge, which would be less than the bottom coil, obviously, because the positive has to channel its way through the drive coil to get to the stator coil. Nonetheless, it will get to the stator coil and to negative without this diode there. So, and then when the top coil gets a small amount of charge from the battery, it blocks the wireless charge coming off the stator, the drive coil. Now, that's magnetic fields impeding each other. So It's optimal not to have the stator coil receive any charge from the battery if it's to pick up wireless EMF from the drive coil below. And that's why this little diode's there. Okay, yeah. So basically, you can see the charge path for the drive coil. Positive comes out here, comes down here, goes back up to here, charges the bottom coil. Positive leaves out the other end of the bottom coil. Heads up to the right side of the relay, which is the negative channel. And that's how that gets charged. So you don't want that. I mean, yeah, that's how that gets charged. And that's all you want. You don't want it, the positive to continue out this way and going through the stator coil out this way, around here. Oh, man, you don't want this positive going this way, continuing on up here to the stator coil. You don't want that. So when it gets to this point, it can go up where the diode is, around back to negative. So that diode's there to block that. And that's wonderful news. And all these diodes are necessary here, all of them. Especially this little one. This one makes the everything work the way it should. Without that little diode there, this top stator coil will receive a small amount of charge from the battery after the battery charges this guy. And that's a problem. Because the small field hitting this coil from the battery charge will impede the field coming off this coil to a small degree, and that'll be basically wasted energy. In two forms of wasted energy. One, the energy going into this coil is wasted, and the energy coming out of this coil trying to hit this coil wirelessly will be wasted. Some of it won't get in. That's a big problem. And of course, when the bottom coil here flies back, let me open that image. Stage 2. Here you see the relays open. When this bottom coil flies back out this way, it has to go through that little diode also. So that diode has to be a high voltage diode, which will double as a high voltage pass and a low voltage block for the previous reason discussed. And the high voltage will go through two diodes to the battery. There's a possibility I don't need two diodes here, but actually I do. I do need the two diodes because here you have the top coil, stator, also flying back positive on this end. and it, comes through here. So you can see that little diode is doing two things. It's blocking the flyback from going back up to the drive coil. Not that that's necessary, because you have this diode here blocking any positive flyback that would get to that point. Yeah, it's only necessary to block the low voltage path this way to negative. It's only there to block low voltage, but the top coil will fly back out this way to positive. And the top coil negative flyback will go this way to negative. So that's how that flies back, nice and easy. Bottom coil flies back through two diodes down the same path, positive. And the negative flies back to negative. Wonderful. Yet still confusing. So, anyone attempting to replicate this, don't try to unconfuse yourself on how it's working and why the diodes are the way they are, because you will probably spend a good 12 hours, like I did, unconfusing yourself. But yeah, that's that, and I just wanted to repeat again why this little diode's there. That's that reason. That's there to block the top coil from getting any charge from the battery post passing through the drive coil, which would be a smaller amount of charge than the drive coil receives, but still enough to impede the wireless transmission to the stator coil above. And of course, this is the flyback diode to the plus. That's the flyback diode to the negative. This is a flyback diode for the top coil to the negative. And this serves as a flyback diode for the both coils, top and bottom. This serves as a flyback diode and a blocking diode for the bottom drive coil to the battery positive. And yeah. So what's this diode doing? It is doing, what is it doing? Okay. Oh. Yes, this diode. So during the induction phase, what this diode is doing is, it's blocking the EMF, the wireless charge from this one, which would be a positive here. And this wireless positive will try to get to the negative here if that diode's not there. And because I need this channel here, I have to have that diode there. So it blocks the positive from getting through here and has it go around to the other diode to positive where it's supposed to go. All right. Over and out.
Come on. Do it. Do it.
Do it.
Do it.
Do it.
Do it. Do it.
Who is doing it?
Do it.
Do it.
All of it.
Do it.
Come on. Do it now.
And I will do the rest.